Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Jakob Rodseth. As Ashok mentioned, I'm a co-founder and engineering manager at Integral. And I actually have the ambition to put you all out of a job permanently. And by the end of this talk, I'm hopefully going to convince you that that's actually a good thing. So first, I would assume that based on the content of this evening's talks and the demographics of individuals who are usually interested in automation, that we actually have maybe a higher than average proportion of gamers in the audience tonight. And a game entitled Detroit Become Human was recently released, and as the name implies, it takes place in a future version of Detroit. Seeing Detroit actually as the backdrop of a major video game title is actually pretty inspiring. The society it depicts is grappling with severe unemployment, mostly as a result of androids who can cook and clean and even conduct hostage negotiation. So if you caught some of the signs there at the end of the clip, they say things like, androids ruined our country. And the ease with which automation lends itself as a metaphor for the current anti-immigration sentiment in the United States should make you question why the negative narrative against immigration that has a primary facet of fear due primarily to job loss due to wage standards shares so much fundamental fear with automation anxiety. And I'll give you a hint, it has something to do with how our economy actually operates. Now, we're not really close to the technology depicted in the game, but the effects of advanced automation on society are already being felt, almost before the implementation of the technology, of the advanced automation itself. A study was just published in Social Science and Medicine in April of this year, titled County-Level Job Automation Risk and Health Evidence from the United States. And it found that just a 10% increase in automation risk to an individual's job is correlated with measurable decreases in aspects of their health. So why does automation risk affect people so significantly? So let's try to understand what's going on here. There are about 206.5 million individuals of working age in the US. And of that, about 3.5% of those are professional truck drivers, or about 3.5 million people. And I think it's very easy to understand, by considering the position that these professional truck drivers are in, why they may be worried. The median truck driver income in the US is just over $40,000 a year, and a typical new diesel semi-truck costs just about $120,000. Now, compare that with the highest range electric Tesla Semi, which costs $180,000. And that's just over what it costs to purchase a new diesel semi-truck and pay a driver for a year. Now, that driver has to sleep and take restroom breaks. They might get sick. They need vacation. A lot of that time, the diesel semi-truck is just going to be sitting around in a lot somewhere, not moving goods around. Right? It's underutilized. Now, the Tesla Semi doesn't drive itself just yet. It has some autonomous capabilities like convoying, but we know, especially being right here in Detroit, that mobility is changing and changing really quickly. These trucks are going to be able to drive themselves more and more until you pretty much just don't even need a human on board at all. And there's actually fully autonomous trucks being tested on the road today. So if it's cheaper in the long term to have semi-trucks drive themselves, there will be higher utilization of their capacity to do work in doing so, and the technology is being tested right now. It's obvious why truck drivers might be worried about their job. And what are they supposed to do if they lose it, right? So trucking pays decently well relative to other jobs in the United States, but it doesn't have a lot of transferable skills. So it's not like these drivers are going to be taking their driving skills and being able to apply them to maybe a taxi position or a bus driving position. Those jobs are going to be automated as well, right? So the only option for them is to either reskill or take a less desirable position that actually requires less skill. Now, here's the question. What if it's not feasible to reskill 3.5 million truck drivers? And what if there aren't enough lower skill jobs to move them into? This could really be a really massive problem. Along with the questions of AI safety, VR viability, and how severe the long-term effects of caffeine abuse are, software engineers need to answer this question. Software engineers can't simply say that our only job is to create software and not consider the repercussions and effects of our work. And luckily, we don't have to start from scratch. This is a question that has been thought about in different forms mainly since the start of the Industrial Revolution. And I'm going to borrow the summation of the thinking on this topic around technological unemployment up to the present day from the introduction to Bruce Bartlett's Is Industrial Innovation Destroying Jobs? And I'm going to spoil the ending for you. Bruce Bartlett, I think, lacks imagination. He concludes his essay by saying that, quote, since the manner in which society will ultimately deal with technology is by definition unknown, it is rather foolhardy to even attempt to project the employment effects of technology, to which I say that's stupid and no fun, so we're going to do it anyway. A quick aside about Mr. Bartlett. He is an American supply-side economist and historian born in Ann Arbor, Michigan, who was domestic policy advisor under Ronald Reagan and Treasury official under George H.W. Bush. Bartlett starts essentially by saying that if easily automated sectors of the economy are really in decline, then there could be a case for creating a quote, economic planning mechanism in the U.S. Now, that's a little bit too much like what Soviet Russia did and what China does today, and both of those places are obviously very scary for an American, especially an American economist. So Bartlett wants to look at both what has been said about technological unemployment and the data around it to dispel this notion that any sort of economic planning mechanism in the United States is required, and that there's no underlying mechanism of the economy that's actually being eroded by technology. And he starts with Adam Smith's general question, quote, what will result from any factor which increases output per unit of labor? And a basic answer to this question is contained in Smith's anecdote of the pin factory. The anecdote goes that an individual in a group of 10 pin makers can make about one pin per day. But when they specialize, they can increase their productivity by a factor of 4,800, meaning that as a group, they can create actually 48,000 pins per day. And Bartlett explains that Smith doesn't answer the question about permanent unemployment that he really set out to explore, but claims that we can infer the answer because one, pins were obviously expensive when they were just one being made per pin maker, and two, they were a luxury, therefore, and of limited use. And therefore, three, new jobs would be created as these pins became more accessible. So this is Bartlett's subscription to supply-side economics talking. And Smith also explores if the pin makers created a monopoly by manipulating prices to force out competition, would this really be a bad thing? And Smith thought, simply put, that the extra profits would be spent on things that would create new employment in other industries. So even there was this pin-making monopoly, the profits generated would create jobs in other sectors. And of course, if this were true, Jeff Bezos' effect on employment would be proportional to his wealth, right? Which is obviously not the case. So this isn't really how the economy works outside of theory. In any case, Smith's conclusion is that higher productivity is always better for society. Now, Ricardo disagreed. Bartlett explains that Ricardo believed that the machinery would actually displace workers' income generally across the board, with a greater and greater proportion going to the capitalist and less to the worker, right? So this is based on the distinction between fixed and variable capital. Fixed capital being the machines and inputs into a productive process, and variable capital being the wages paid to workers who manipulate the machines and resources in order to create the product. So Ricardo is essentially saying that fixed capital's role in the productive process will steal from the variable capitals, or in other words, automation would make workers more and more poor because less and less of the total income would be allocated to them. And French economist Jean-Baptiste Say responded to Ricardo's argument by positing that, quote, machinery merely augments the productivity of labor. To the extent that more output is created with fewer inputs, society is necessarily better off. This is pretty much echoing Smith's argument. And Say's rebuttal really is essentially that one, machines are hard to build, and two, they always lower prices. And the first point is really composed of two, trying to make 2 points. One, because machines take a long time to create and a lot of effort, this creates jobs. And also because they take a long time to create and a lot of effort, their introduction into the economy is generally slow. So the change is slow, the disruption they cause is slow, and workers have time to adjust to the disruption. And the second point is emphasizing that all consumers, the workers who are affected by automation included, benefit from the lower prices that automation brings to the productive process. Now, Marx's response is that Say's argument is, quote, insipid nonsense, which I have to agree with. Marx builds on top of Ricardo's argument by looking towards, quote, historical data and refutations of the views of other economists who endorse Dave's position. So it was a little academic. I apologize if it was painful. We're going to have a little more, but I promise it's almost over. To recap, there are mainly two theories about technological unemployment. Either you have basically people like Ricardo and Marx on the critical or affirmative side. Yes, technological unemployment is a problem and will continue to get worse. And then you have Smith, Say, and Bartlett on the dismissive side. It's not an issue and it just won't ever be, really, at least not within a reasonable time frame. So which kind of one of these sides would the truck drivers fall under? Which, when they think about their own position that they're in, how would they think about it? And I don't think most workers think about this historical discussion in this way, or even their own situation in these sorts of terms. But I would say that their reasoning and fears probably would be categorized under the critical theory, and for good reason. Wages are stagnant, workers are being displaced, and technology is progressing and accelerating like it really never has before. So I'll fast forward through Bartlett's discussion of the Great Depression to the automation scare of the 1950s, where he examines Walter Heller, who was a chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under Kennedy. Heller's main addition to this discussion was that his position that technological unemployment will not become a problem because there are always more complex jobs. So he argued that, quote, we should focus on education, worker retraining, and labor mobility to mitigate whatever temporary dislocations may result from automation. And this brings us all the way to the present. And Professor Vasily Leontiev mostly agreed with Ricardo and Marx. He asked how fast would the economy have to grow in order to keep the number of long-distance telephone operators from decreasing in the face of the fact that each of them will soon be able to handle 10 million calls instead of 1,000. So basically, if Heller is wrong, if there aren't always more complex jobs available, or if it's not feasible to reskill workers quickly enough, Leontiev's question essentially shows that the only remaining option to prevent technological unemployment is to grow the demand for workers in industries which are being automated, i.e. as the amount of human labor in a particular industry decreases, increase demand on that industry proportionally. And obviously this can't be done to any useful end, right? So the concept is also limited by the possibility of advanced automation that can just completely displace the majority or even all workers. For example, there are still actually very few elevator operators employed in the world. The guys who would, like, you get in and they ask you what floor and they move the lever up and down, they got the hats and everything. They mainly work in large cities where they're highly advanced high-speed elevators, or they're culturally important. But the question is, how many more elevators would we need? How many high-speed, really difficult for machines to operate elevators would we need to keep all of these operators employed indefinitely? And what happens when computers can actually take over those jobs? Or elevator operators simply fall out of fashion culture. They're just no longer trendy. So there's obviously a point where human labor committed to a particular job is just completely silly. And Bartlett has a real problem here with this issue. And this is where his own argument really, really explicitly starts. And his answer, as I spoiled at the start, is that worrying about Leontiev's question is like, quote, worrying about when the sun will burn out, as it inevitably will one day. So this is why I say Bartlett lacks imagination. He's too caught up in past trends and what has happened in the past and not what could happen based on present, especially given today's ever-accelerating pace of technological progress. And his response to the fundamental underpinnings of Ricardo, Marx, and Leontiev is actually to quote Schumpeter, who is interesting in is that Schumpeter mostly agreed with the collapse of capitalism that Marx predicted, but the disagreement between them was actually surrounding why capitalism would collapse, not really if. And out of that disagreement came the quote that Bartlett uses. Schumpeter's claim that capitalist machinery replaces workmen who've never been born. So now I think we're really in trouble. Not only in Bartlett's position, this idea that automation only displaces future workers, it's not only a non sequitur, right? He had just claimed that worrying about Leontiev's position is like worrying about the sun burning out. So I think this is pretty much patently false, and we can all we need to do is examine the horse and mule population in the United States since 1900. So in 1900, there were 20 million horses and mules in the U.S. and 8,000 automobiles. And fast forward 60 years, and there are 3 million horses and mules and over 73 million automobiles. And when was the last time any of us took a horse and carriage to work, or even just for pleasure, right? Now replace horses with people and automobiles with robots, and it becomes obvious that machinery replaces workers. This isn't only a truism, but arguing against it requires mental acrobatics. So I may have actually been wrong. Bartlett may actually have an overactive imagination. And lastly, on Bartlett, Smith, and Say, to their claim that more productivity always is a benefit to society and does not result in an increasingly disproportionate distribution of wealth among workers and capitalists, we simply have to look at the past 40 years of wage stagnation. As you can see, productivity has continued its relentless march forward, and we haven't all suddenly grown extra arms or something. So the only explanation for this is that we're continuing to make better and better machines. However, since the late 70s and early 80s, hourly compensation has become completely detached from productivity. And as a side note, hopefully you all remember which president Bartlett was a domestic policy advisor under. So let's take a moment to review the main points we really discussed. Smith's original general question, what will result from any factor which increases output per unit of labor, is really a question about how capitalism deals with the following requirement of human labor in the productive process. And I think we've come to a question even more general than Smith's. Can the way in which we as a human race have organized the vast majority of production of goods and services throughout the world be sustained indefinitely? Or does advanced automation do something that breaks a fundamental mechanism of this organizational system? And I want to be very clear what I mean when I say the capitalist mode of production here. This is obviously a Marxist term, which I'm using somewhat loosely, to basically mean a mode of production where there is fixed capital, machines and resources, variable capital, workers who don't control the machines and resources. They can't decide what to create with them. And capitalists, those who own the machinery and resources and determine what to pay the workers out of the income produced from the labor, and then pocket the rest as profits. So this definition would include China, the United States, even the Soviet Union's mode of production could have been categorized under this definition. And we can probably answer this question by reevaluating theorists like Bartlett, Smith, and Say. First, is this simply just a problem for the future indefinitely? Will this never really happen in a reasonable time span? And the answer to that is obviously not. Where are all the horses? Fixed capital that can do the work of variable capital obviously displaces it. So maybe we can grow job demand fast enough to mitigate worker displacement. And I don't think those elevator operators will have their jobs indefinitely. And frankly, I don't think truck drivers will for much longer either. So maybe we can reskill workers fast enough to make up for the disruption and move them into more complex jobs. I don't really know, but I kind of doubt it. We have enough trouble trying to just get enough people into college, much less 3.5 million professional truck drivers, some with families, debts, some close to retirement, right? There's also no evidence that we'll always have more complex positions for them to actually be reskilled into. So maybe you can survive without a job. And now we've obviously reached absurdity, right? You obviously cannot buy things with no money, not in the current sort of way we've modeled our society. So do we have to go back to being hunter-gatherers? Do we have to discard all of our technology and go back to primitive communism? I would prefer not all of us to go back to scavenging just so that we can all have a job, right? That seems kind of pointless. So I think it's pretty clear that the critical theory wins out. Technological unemployment is happening and is going to continue to happen to no end. But I'm not happy to just say that our current organization of labor looks like it will break down due to widespread automation without understanding why. And I think the illuminating kernel of the discussion that we just sped through that can help us understand why lies in asking this question. Why does automation make things cheaper? And I'm going to turn again to Marxist theory for a moment, and I just want to dispel any confusion. Marxism is not socialism or communism, and especially not the authoritarian monstrosity most people really associate it with. It's simply a critical theory of capitalism that can help us answer these sorts of questions. And there are a lot of pressures that urge us to not look too hard at the way that we've organized labor throughout the world. So for everyone thinking like, oh, we all know how good communism looks on paper, but it'll never work, or I've heard more Marxist terms used in the past 15 minutes than the rest of my life combined, and I don't know why, but I don't like it. I sympathize with your discomfort, but that's really missing the point of what I'm trying to get to. So now that I'm sorry? No, it's not. So I've hopefully exercised your inner reactionary a bit here. And let's try and take a moment to simply try and concisely understand why the organization of labor may break as automation becomes widespread. And I'm going to take the definition for the labor theory of value right from Wikipedia, about as unbiased as I can get. The labor theory of value is a theory of value that argues that the economic value of a good or service is determined by the total socially necessary labor required to produce it, rather than the pleasure its owner gets from it, or its use value to its owner, or its scarcity value. So this would be supply and demand. Hopefully not too disturbing for any of us so far. So based on this theory, it's fair to say that as the socially necessary labor required to produce something approaches zero, the economic value of just stuff generally will also fall to zero. And I think there's a somewhat concise way of thinking about this. You can imagine maybe I have one nail, and this nail has a unit price of 3 cents. And perhaps one of you is my neighbor, and you're building a fence or birdhouse or something. It doesn't really matter, and you just ran out of nails. You need one more. And you come over and you ask me, can I have one of your nails, please? And is it really in my best interest? Is it really worth my time to even go through the process of, say you have $1. Oh, okay, I got to get you $1. I got to find 97 cents. I got to give you it's too much effort. It just doesn't make sense for me to do. So just the effort of breaking down your dollar and going through that transaction is more effort really required than me just giving you the nail and saying, hi, thanks, go finish your fence or whatever. So how can this nail be so cheap? Well, the socially necessary labor required to produce one of these nails is really the required input by a human is practically zero, right? Most of the labor is actually likely required in getting the resources to make the nail, distributing them, marketing them, managing them, that sort of thing. Nails are just incredibly easy for machines to create with almost no human involvement involved. In fact, it's very possible that unless we use the sorts of systems that Ashok was talking about to understand how many nails we really need to make, it's very, very easy with our current technology to actually overproduce many different kinds of goods if we're not measuring exactly how many we should be making correctly. Or else the repercussion of making too many is that the amount of human labor contained in any one nail would be distributed over more and more, and the value of a particular nail would just go to a fraction of a fraction of a fraction until it is effectively worthless. That's basically what applying the theory to this would yield. So if most goods and services reach the same level of required human labor to produce, we have an issue. And even as Bartlett conceded inadvertently, I think, it's not a matter of if this will happen, but when it's going to happen. So what we really discovered is that we haven't reached a terminal state in history. There's this odd prevalence of the idea in society that we have somehow reached just a plateau, so to speak, right? In other words, that capitalism is a stable system that will never generate anything itself that would actually threaten the system. So I guess we'll have incremental economic growth forever, incrementally better productivity every year, social mobility, standards of living will go up indefinitely, right? But capitalism, just like hunter-gatherer communism, slavery, feudalism, all these other ways of organizing labor, it can only exist within a certain range of social and economic progress. As far as these systems go, when we move outside of their ranges that they can exist in, they stop being viable. So we're going to have to change how we organize labor, especially if labor is not really necessary anymore. We're going to have to change how we distribute the resources and goods and services that we have globally. And there are lots of other economic modes of production that I've hinted at, perhaps throughout this talk, that have been proposed, and we may even have to invent some new ones. Most of the time, discussing these sorts of things makes people just very angry. But soon we're going to have to get over our discomfort and explore and perhaps, like I said, invent new ways of doing this. And this is the end, so please get ready with any questions you have. I've gone slightly over, I apologize. But there's this concept of post-scarcity society, which I really think best describes the environment in which we're moving towards. And the concept of post-scarcity is really just that. It's a state in which humanity has departed really from its entire history and way of interacting with the environment, always wanting, always requiring to get more stuff to sustain ourselves and expending a lot of energy to do so. The technology that capitalism creates may very well accidentally put us into this state. And there are actually suggestions that if we organized correctly today, just with the resources and technology that we have, that we could actually reach a level of post-scarcity where everyone could have their needs of food, shelter, healthcare, education, and even more met. And that's just by moving the pieces around with what we have right now. But this would obviously be really, really hard to do. It would take global consensus, something that really takes a long time to generate on anything. And we'd have to overcome a lot of really built-in instinctual factors to do this. Things like aggression, fear, in-group, out-group think, tribalism. Frustratingly, all of these things we've developed to combat scarcity. And ironically enough, they're now the things getting in our way to really eliminate scarcity altogether. And I'll just close by clarifying that this isn't some utopian idea. There are going to be massive, massive new kinds of problems that come along with this sort of society. And things like how do we decide what to produce? How do we manage resource limitations? How do we distribute goods and services? How do we deal with the existential mental strain that people may have? People gain a lot of value from going to work and spending the majority of the day at work with coworkers and that sort of thing. So there will be a lot of new interesting problems to solve, but I think they're far more worthwhile problems to grapple with than the things we're grappling with today. And at the very least, it seems like we'll soon be able to close really the first chapter of the entirety of human history and really start a new one, brand new and fresh. So with that, thank you all very much for your attention. I know that was a little bit long. What questions do you have? Yes?
Okay, I had a question about what you said about labor.
Yes.
And my question is, what about jobs that can't be automated at all?
Jobs that can't be automated at all. So,
like selling something.
Sure, yes. So in the near term, I agree that's probably not feasible. Just like we saw in the intro with the video game, we're obviously a very long way from that sort of technology. But the question is more about feasibility and if it's going to happen eventually. And I think the answer probably is that we're going to get to a point where we can create machines that can sell things to us very, very easily. So it may be more of a question of time frame than if. Yeah. Yes, Evgeny. Or the gentleman right here, if you don't want to ask. Yes.
Most of your presentation was based in economics.
Yes.
What if it wasn't? And then I'll sit there, I'll ask that question.
Sure.
And I'll sit there and ask, your last slide was very interesting. What about a post-abundance society? As
Post-abundance.
opposed to looking at the negative side
Sure.
of where we're headed. Let's look at the positive side of where we're headed. That's sitting there and mundane tasks are taken care of.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay. What about a post-positive society where we have all the economics handled?
Mm-hmm.
So why the negativeness is the second question I have.
Okay. That maybe I may have come off negative, maybe particularly in the beginning.
I'm not disagreeing
Sure.
with what you're saying is negative. Understand that.
Okay. I don't think I don't.
Look at it,
Yeah.
look at it from a positive sense.
So hopefully.
Make the same presentation.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Hopefully there was a positive maybe message in the end. I think the conclusion.
I mean, I think one of the, can I interrupt?
I'm saying your presentation was
Yes.
There's more to human existence.
Sure. Yeah. That is correct.
There's
Yeah.
peace, there's tranquility, there's good stuff.
Yep. I think the primary concern I was trying to address is that of the truck driver, the worker who is unsure of their future and how they're going to survive, basically, which is primarily an economic question. So that's the approach I took.
Assume that can happen and proceed from there. Assume that we can determine how to handle that. What is that society really going to do?
It's an interesting question. Yes, absolutely. I think the theory probably points towards that it's improbable that, given the current constraints of how we've organized labor, that it's really going to be able to.
I also want to point out,
Okay.
most of us are engineers. You knew that Einstein sat there and created a formula equals mc squared plus. And it was only when we broke the thought process that said, okay, let's not be constrained by our past, that we now are looking at unbelievable new stuff, multi-dimensional stuff. I think we face a very similar situation here, that we are putting up our own boundaries. Let them go.
Absolutely.
Start thinking about the post-abundance.
I think we're mostly on the same page. Maybe just a difference in tone. But I appreciate the question. Thank you. Yes, Evgeny, or Amy, please. Yes.
I was just going to say kind of the same thing on the positive side. When you showed the picture of the telephone operators, I thought you were going to say the other statistics that I heard was that, during Reagan's time, they said that, the telephone operators used to do all the switching by hand, right? And then they went to digital switching.
Mm-hmm.
But even in 1996 or 1986, if everything was still by hand, there weren't enough women in the U.S. If every single woman worked doing the switching, you couldn't put all the phone calls that were going through. So the other thing is there'd be no engineering computer jobs if that didn't happen and you didn't need telephone operators.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point.
That's the kind of the positive side of it is there's already so much change and it's not totally the end of the world yet.
Appreciate the comment. Yep. Evgeny, yes.
I had a question. So in this future world, do you think certain kinds of unique labor becomes more valuable in that case?
So yeah, there is the question of this is sort of maybe the end state would be perhaps this post-scarcity society, but I think there's a long road in between. There's a lot of incremental steps getting there, and absolutely along the way, we're going to have to grapple with issues of as those less complex, less skilled jobs are basically made obsolete in terms of the human application to them. How do we deal with the increasing sort of implicit value that places on the more complex jobs like engineering, doctor positions, even creative work, right? There is huge risk of perhaps a large imbalance being created there, and perhaps the temptation to overcompensate and really provide a lot of value to the individuals who do those complex jobs. So it's a really interesting question. I don't know if I have a distinct answer for it, but I think it's going to be an issue. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
Yes, absolutely. Any other questions?
You really need to think about distinguishing between, quote unquote, making the judgment of non-relevant jobs and relevant jobs. Why? Why do we want to do that? Picking up trash could be considered an irrelevant job, but it is relevant to society.
Absolutely. Yes.
Right? So why are we making a judgment of relevant jobs, i.e. engineering, but not some other job as being just as relevant or less relevant?
Yeah.
Why don't we just give that out and start talking about
Yep. No, I think it's less about the significance or the value of the job to society, and more about the required human labor involved from a technology perspective. That was really the point being made. Yes. Yes, please.
It's kind of a two-pronged thing. First is, if these theories hold true, we should be seeing measurable effects of it. And you showed that kind of with your forest example.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, global employment has risen drastically since the Industrial Revolution. It has not decreased. The average person's wealth has also actually increased.
Yep.
And so, as far as can you confirm your theories with a measurable experiment, as we would in the scientific method, all observable phenomena are pointing to the opposite of that theory. Now, I know you're saying your theory reaches a critical mass, right? And at the critical mass, then it will drop off, right? It's fair. The other thing I want to add to that is actually an interesting thing we're seeing in our, you would call it like late capitalism, or like something like that, like our economy here, is that all those jobs that people started to automate are actually really high in demand, and no one does them, like welding and plumbing, or you know what I'm saying, skilled trades, factory labor. Like Ford, for example, has a tough time finding enough people to staff their factory, right? So I found that to be interesting too, that there's, even if, let's say what your theory is true, might be, but there's a lag to it, where there's going to be like an interim time where those jobs are actually really valuable because no one's doing it, right?
Yeah, if you take individual sort of snapshots in time of, plus minus 10, 20, 30 years, you're going to get those sorts of really interesting like fluctuations. And yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that stuff's a really big problem today. This was, of course, looking at the very long term, maybe tens, centuries even at that point, right? So that was to your second comment. To the first comment about maybe trends we're seeing today, again, that was sort of the point of the horse analogy, or maybe even the elevator operator analogy, that yes, there are relevant jobs that stay on, and we continue to have those sorts of micro fluctuations within them, but in the very long term, like telephone operators really are not employed anymore, at least not nearly in the capacity that we saw. So it's looking at the very, very long-term trends. But yeah, that's absolutely, absolutely, yep.